One more time. Welcome back to my video series where I take you through all of the steps that you need to know to build a quadcopter from start to finish. From a pile of parts on the bench to a complete, fully configured and built quadcopter ready to fly. I wonder if you went back and just watched a montage of me doing the intro to the videos. From the very first video to this is now like the 15th video, how would the intro have changed? And yet I put the intro at the beginning of every one, just in case you just dropped in here randomly, instead of following along for videos 1 through 17. And if you did just drop in here randomly, after you're done watching this video, check out the playlist in the video description and follow along with us as we build a quadcopter. In this video, we are setting up iNav so that our quadcopter can fly autonomously with GPS and kind of like a DJI drone. But there's something we gotta change, because this GPS unit that came with the Tyro 119, it is not going to do everything that iNav needs it to do, and we're going to have to swap it out. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. You're going to learn that you're going to need to buy a different GPS. While I disassemble this quadcopter, let me tell you why we need to use a different GPS than the one that came with it. And by the way, since I know you're all going to ask, link to this little tool down in the video description if you like. So GPSs obviously pick up GPS data, right? They pick up GPS coordinates, and they tell the quadcopter where it is on Earth. But where it is on Earth is not the only thing that a quadcopter needs to know in order to fly itself. It also needs to know where it's facing. And if you think about it, just because you know where you are doesn't know the direction that you're facing. And I could tell you you're in your bedroom and you're standing 1 foot away from your bed. Now, I want you to fall forward. Does it matter which direction you're facing? Yes, because if you're facing away from your bed, you're going to fall onto the floor, right? So the quadcopter, in order to fly itself autonomously, it needs to know where it is. It needs to know like how fast it's going, which it can figure out, because if it knows where it is and where it's moving, it can figure out how fast it's going. And it can kind of take a guess at which direction it's facing. There's a parameter that a GPS unit reports called GPS heading, and GPS heading is based on the direction that we're moving, which direction are we probably facing. And for an airplane, GPS heading actually works okay, because an airplane always moves forward, right? An airplane can't really move sideways, not very effectively anyway. But for a quadcopter, GPS heading is not sufficient, because if you think about it, a quadcopter can fly in a given direction, and then it can just pitch back and go back the other way, right? And GPS heading matters, or the direction the quadcopter is facing matters, especially when you're doing autonomous flight, because GPS heading doesn't update immediately. If we stop and we hover and then we rotate and start moving a different direction, the GPS heading is going to still point the old direction at first, and then as we begin moving, it will update to tell us which direction we're really facing. But that could be bad. If we're trying to fly home, we're trying to do like a return to home autonomously, and we start flying the wrong direction for 30 feet because GPS heading hasn't updated yet, well, we could crash or something bad could happen. So in order to take full advantage of iNav's functionality, you need a GPS unit with a built-in compass. Well, you need a compass. You don't have to have it built into the GPS, but that's pretty much how it's always done. And the GPS unit that ships with this Tyro 119 doesn't have a compass built in. It's small, it's light, it's cheap, but it doesn't have a compass. So we are going to be installing this guy. There's a link to this guy down in the video description. This is a GPS unit that has a built-in compass. It is the Bentian BN880. I think the one that we got was either the 180 or the 220. And the good news is that our flight controller can, in fact, use a compass. Not all flight controllers can. All iNav flight controllers can, but not all flight controllers can. in order for a flight controller to use a compass, it has to have two pads broken out, the SDA and the SCL pads. That is an interface known as I2C or I2C, and that's how the compass will communicate with the flight controller. And fortunately, our flight controller does have that, since it was designed to work with iNav in the first place. So you probably don't have this compass already purchased, so you're welcome to keep watching this video. But if you don't have the compass pre-purchased, then you're going to need to go buy it and then come back. There we go. Taking off the old compass, and we're just pulling it out of there. And we will also disconnect the camera just to get it out of the way. And I've taken the screws off the flight controller. I'm going to disconnect this MMCX connector. Just grasp it firmly as close to the base as you can and wiggle it until it pops out. Don't pull on the cable, and try and pull it perpendicular to the direction. Don't try and like yank it out at an odd angle. We've got a little resistance here. Something is holding this in. Oh, it's the receiver. Well, I sure don't want to. I'll see if I can just kind of move that out of the way, because the receiver is going to be a pain in the butt to disconnect. But yeah, what we really want to get at, oh sorry, that's the video transmitter, my bad. We'll disconnect the video transmitter, and that's going to get us at the flight controller, and that's really where we're trying to get. And I'm actually going to need to get at the underside of the flight controller, because this plug that comes with this GPS unit doesn't have the, it's not the correct plug for our flight controller. So rather than try to make a plug that is correct, I'm just going to solder the wires on. Unfortunately, our flight controller does have solder pads. Very thoughtful of the designers to make that available to us. So just very carefully going to lift this up and flip it over. I can disconnect the ESC. That'll give me a little more flexibility. There we go. Now I want you to see what I've done here. I've placed the flight controller on top of these two standoff screws to hold it in place, but the flight controller itself is hanging out over the edge, and it is not on top of the ESC. And the reason is that I never want to solder on top of my ESC, because if a little blob of solder falls on the ESC, or sometimes you'll get these little things called solder balls that just bing, pop off, then they can ruin the ESC. So it's hanging off the side, but I can still get at these pins, pads, and these are the pads that I want: 5-volt, negative, TX, RX, SDA, and SCL. Now I want you to take a look at how I have plugged this in, and I want you to take a look at the color of my wires and the order that they go in. I want you to make sure you do the same, because the other end of this plug doesn't match. And actually, if I remember correctly, they actually shipped it with this end with two plugs on it, one of them with the SDA and SCL wires broken out. I tried combining them to see if it would plug into the flight controller and save us the step of soldering, but the size of the plug on the other end doesn't match, and it just won't work. So I want you to take and plug yours in so that your colors exactly match mine, as shown here. And then we're going to take the other end and we're going to cut it off. And we are going to prep each of these. If you've never done this before, you may struggle a little bit, but we're going to prep by just stripping the insulation off of each of them. The challenge here is to do it without cutting the wire. I am using a diagonal cutter, which professional solderers will tell you is not the way to do it, because you'll nick the wire or cut the wire. They'll say you should use a stripping tool, and if you have one of those, oh, see, I did it. See how I cut that wire? Oops. Oh no, whatever will I do? How will I rectify this horrible situation? Now I've got my soldering iron. It's set to, oh, it doesn't really, this is easy. This should be maybe 700 degrees Fahrenheit, or whatever that is. 350 Celsius? Whatever that is. 700 degrees Fahrenheit. Could be lower. These are tiny wires, but this is a good all-around temperature. And I'm going to twist, first of all, I'm going to twist, sorry about the out of focus, but you get the drill. Twist these together so they're nice and twisted, and so they are not splayed out like this. See that? That's splayed out. That's no good. Twist them together. Don't twist them together with each other. Twist them together with themselves. Okay, nicely twisted. And then I'm going to get my solder. The solder that I'm using is 6040 rosin core leaded solder. You want rosin core solder because it has flux in it, which improves your joints. And you want leaded solder because it helps, it just performs better. Just don't eat it and you'll be okay. Even these fumes that are getting in my face, which I should have a fume extractor, but it makes a lot of noise on video, so I often don't use it for video. These fumes are not lead fumes. They are they're the fumes from the flux, which probably aren't that great to breathe either. So, you know, use a fume extractor, use a fan. Even a fan blowing past you can be useful. And then having done that, we're going to snip all these to the correct length of about 2 millimeters, I would say. It's a little tough because this is plastic insulation, and as we heat the wire, the insulation melts back slightly. Silicone insulation is better because it doesn't do that, but it's also more expensive. Now we're going to tin these wires, and that means to just get a little bit of flux on the wire, on the pads. You can see me there using a drag soldering technique, where just with a wide flat tip, you just kind of pull a pool of wet solder across all of them, and you end up with, however you do it, we'll get a nicely tin. And then this is the pinout for this GPS. SDA, ground, TX, RX, VCC, or 5 volts, and SCL. And this is a little confusing because 5 volts goes to 5 volts. 5 volts on the GPS goes to 5 volts on the flight controller. Ground on the GPS goes to ground on the flight controller. SDA on the GPS goes to SDA on the flight controller. SCL goes to SCL. And TX goes to RX. And RX goes to TX. That's just how serial interfaces are always designated. And you just kind of got to remember that little quirk. As I do this, I am going to verify that the wire header that I've got matches the colors on this pinout. It will happen to you at some point in your life that you're soldering something up and you've got the same colors in your header, but maybe they're in a different order because you've grabbed the wrong wire header from your pile. I don't know. So I'm just going to verify. The leftmost one is yellow, then black, then white, then green, then red, not brown. Aha! That's probably red. It's probably red in the image. Red and then gray. Okay, so they are in the right order. The first one is SDA, which is going to go to SDA on the flight controller. Let's do it. And when you're done, this is what you should have. Hey there, folks. It's Joshua from the future with a little tip. The way that Joshua has wired this up is, it's okay, but there's a better way. The problem with this is that this 5-volt pad, like most of the 5-volt pads everywhere on the flight controller, it doesn't power up when you plug into USB. And the reason for that is that, like, you don't want the camera powering up. If you have LEDs on there, all the stuff you might be running on 5 volts, you don't want that turning on when you plug into USB. In fact, it could pull so much power that it actually pulls more power than your USB port is capable of. So the problem with that is that when you plug into USB, like to configure the flight controller will think you don't have a GPS unit unless you also plug in a battery. And that's kind of a pain in the butt. You don't want to be plugging in a LiPo every time you go to configure this. So here's how we're going to fix that. We are going to move the power wire for this GPS over here. This is where the receiver is wired up, and the receiver does get power from USB. And the reason for that is that it just helps you to be able to configure your flight modes and so forth. Well, that's exactly why we want the GPS to be powered from USB. So we're going to move the GPS wire over from here. And the GPS, we could put it on 5 volts, but we would have to put it on this 5-volt pad. And this 5-volt pad is pretty tiny, so wiring both of those wires to this one pad would be pretty tricky. But there's a workaround, and that is that there is a 3.3-volt output right here, this pad, and that is intended for use with Spectrum receivers, which take 3.3 volts. But the GPS that we're using can take 3.3 volts or 5 volts. So we're going to wire the GPS to this pad, and then it will get power from USB, and that will be good. So we're going to desolder that. Okay. Now we should get power when we plug in USB without plugging in the battery. Hey, fair warning. At some point in a future video, you're going to see me plug in USB and the GPS is not going to power up because I don't have the battery plugged in. That was recorded before that's why I came back and made this change. And when you see that, don't get confused. The next thing we need to do is go into the iNav Ports tab and tell the flight controller which of its UARTs each of these peripherals, the receiver, the video transmitter, the GPS, is attached to. In order to give you a little more background on that and just show you how we need to set it up, I'm going to show you the footage from my Betaflight tutorial. It turns out it's exactly the same for Betaflight as it is for iNav in this specific instance, and I already said it really good the first time, so why try to repeat myself? Take it away, Joshua, from the past. So I want to take you back to this still image from when I soldered up the receiver. And what I want you to see is that some of these pads are labeled TX5, RX5, RX2, and each of these is referring to a UART, U-A-R-T, or just pronounced UART. And the way I want you to think of a UART is it's kind of like a USB port on a computer, in that it is used to, you plug your mouse into the USB port. Well, we're going to connect our receiver to a UART on the flight controller. We're going to connect the GPS antenna to a different UART on the flight controller. And basically different peripherals can plug in or get soldered to these UARTs, and the flight controller will talk to them over the UART, the same way your computer gets data from a computer mouse or a Wi-Fi card over USB. Now here in Betaflight, we can go to the Ports tab, and these are the UARTs that our flight controller has. And you can see that they are numbered UART 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Not all flight controllers will have the same number of UARTs, and sometimes they skip numbers. So you may have a flight controller that has 1, 3, 5, but not 2 and 4. Don't worry. But whatever UARTs you see there will have a corresponding pin or pad on the flight controller. So here we can see that on this flight controller, there's two pads, one labeled TX5 and one labeled RX5. TX stands for transmit, RX stands for receive. Each UART will typically have a transmit and a receive pad, and the number 5 there indicates that this is UART 5. So what we need to know is, what UART number did I connect each of my different peripherals to? Now, Joshua in the past was talking about the serial receiver, and in fact, we are going to set that up in a future video. But what we're doing right here is we're setting up the GPS. So let's just focus on that for the time being. And the GPS, in my case, is connected to UART 1. If you look back, or if you look underneath your flight controller, the pads you soldered to are TX1 and RX1. Now, so in order to do that, we're going to need to enable the GPS sensor for UART 1. But I want to show you that in iNav, there is another thing enabled on UART 1 that is called MSP. And it's not a good time for us to go into depth on what MSP is, but you can't have more than one thing enabled on a UART at a time. There are a few exceptions to that rule, but in general, that's true. So in order to enable GPS on UART 1, we are going to need to disable MSP. I want to warn you that if you disable MSP on the USB VCP port, then you will not be able to connect to your flight controller via USB anymore. And basically, it's not dead, but you'll have to reflash it and you'll lose your whole configuration and you have to wipe it from scratch. So don't do that. It even has a warning up here telling you not to do that. But here on UART 1, we're going to disable MSP and we're going to set the sensor to GPS and save and reboot. Now at this point, if we look up in the sensors display here, we can see the GPS sensor is still blacked out. So we're not quite done yet. The next thing we want to do is go to the configuration tab, and here in the configuration tab, we need to enable the GPS feature. So it's kind of confusing that you enable it in the ports tab, but then after enabling it in the ports tab, you have to enable it in the configuration tab too. It's kind of like when you buy a house, they don't automatically turn on your cable. You have to call the cable company. So we told the flight controller where the GPS was going to be. Now we're going to tell it that, yes, in fact, it is there. And we're going to enable that here in the configuration tab. And we'll hit save and reboot. And we still don't have a GPS. Oh, well, it just turned red. Red means I'm trying to have it, but I'm not, I don't see it. I think it should be there. Black means I don't even think it should be there. We don't even have this. Red means I think it should be there, but it's not work. Oh. I see the problem. I see the... I have to... It's not powered up. The GPS isn't powered up. Watch the GPS when I plug in. Ah, okay. See, we got a flashing blue LED. It's actually powered up. Now let's give that a second to wake up, and I hope that we see this GPS icon turn blue. Oh, perfect! The GPS icon has turned blue. That means that the flight controller is talking to the GPS, and that is exactly what we want to see. Now, if you have a GPS unit with a compass or magnetometer in it, there's one more step that you need to take, and that is to scroll up here to where it says Sensors, and we're going to set the magnetometer to Auto, and save and reboot. RX going to TX on the flight controller, so just double check your wiring. Another thing is that not all flight control modules have exactly the same settings. So here in the Ports tab, you may need a different baud rate for your GPS. The default baud rate of 115200 may not be correct for your GPS unit. In order to find out the answer to that, you might be able to look at the product page for your GPS, and somewhere on there it may say the baud rate is 9600 instead, or something like that. The other thing that may be different for your GPS is that the protocol that my GPS is using is a protocol called u-blox. However, another common protocol that you may find yours using is NMEA. However, u-blox is the one that's most likely to be right, but if that was incorrect, then your GPS wouldn't work. So you might try changing that. And that is going to bring us to the end of the video. We've got our GPS and our compass working, and in a future video, we'll actually do something interesting with them. But for the time being, that's where we're going to sign off. Follow along with the rest of this build series, or catch up with where we are. If you just found this video randomly and you want to build this quadcopter and follow along, there's a link in the video description to the playlist that has all the videos for both Betaflight and iNav setup of this quadcopter, and of course the building of the quadcopter. And there are links to the quadcopter itself. If you want to buy the kit, you can buy it and have everything you need to follow along. That's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching. Happy flying. Eventually, when you get this set up, you'll have happy flying. That's the goal.